Please welcome the moderator of the next session, Kacper Rękawek.
Very many thanks, ladies and gentlemen, and can I please call our great speakers, Nathalie, Loiseau, Adriana, Tudela, and Martin Hlaváček to join me here on stage, and a round of applause for them, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. So just a quick roundup, very many thanks for joining us here, and welcome to Prague this time. I'm saying this conscious of the fact I used to work at Globsec when it was in Bratislava. My first time in Prague, I love it. I hope you guys do as well. Today, we're looking at what I would call a pretty hot topic. It's always hot. It never gets cold, but it got hotter, I would say, in Europe after 2022, and we have a great lineup of speakers and contributors to actually discuss this topic. I'm supposed to tell you that please do join us via Slido with your questions. So they will come up on my screen, and I'll do my best to put them to our great speakers. You have them here, so I won't further, we will not be using more time to introduce them, but we have, well, quite a few interesting perspectives, so to speak, and we'll look at the problem from different angles. Illicit trade, shadow economy, and how it not only is about certain numbers, scale, and loss of budget, which is extremely important, but we'll also look into the different direction. We want to look at how it might influence certain states, rogue states, foreign and security policy, or I would say insecurity policy that they cause upon us. And thankfully, we also have Adriana here to actually, tell us Europeans that maybe sometimes we do things wrong. Or maybe we are too optimistic, too pessimistic, too naive, or whatever. It would be great to actually hear from you on this point as well. But a first question that I have to all of our panelists, we'll start with Nathalie, then we'll go to Adriana, and then we go to Martin. The first question is, when, or maybe like this, I think most of us in this room, unfortunately, and most of us in the conference in Prague, Czech Republic, European Union, have somehow, to some extent, at least once in their lives, used the shadow economy in this way or another. And I'm not thinking, robbing a bank and then, I don't know, robbing a store and then selling those goods illicitly. Absolutely not. I'm thinking about petty small things. I have a confession to make. I'm of that generation that was downloading a lot of movies, videos, a lot of British music, British indie music in the early 21st century. I loved it. But then I came to study in Belfast, and I remember this headline, which I'm hoping we're gonna bring up on screen. Terror groups move into pirated DVDs as profits overtake drugs. And, I don't want to say I had a premonition like Jesus Christ, but yeah, it was a bit of a moment for me, so to speak, that I no longer wanted to download the latest album by Maximo Park and play it on my, on my Discman. I was kind of thinking that, okay, this has serious consequences. And I was wondering if I could ask all of my panelists, maybe, not that if you have a similar story, but if, the usage of illicit economy that, didn't harm the world that much, but you're aware of that maybe I shouldn't have. Or someone from your friends, colleagues, family, so that I'm not asking for a confession. Nathalie, over to you. Welcome back again,
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be in Globsec, either in Bratislava or in Prague.
Or in Prague, yes.
Yes, of course. I have 4 kids. And came the moment where I saw them downloading illegally movies online. And it seemed a lot of fun to them, and they were telling me, no, Mommy, you don't have to pay for this. I can provide the movie. Yeah. I said, well, sounds exciting, but first of all, there are artists behind movies, and they deserve copyrights, and they deserve to be paid for their creation. But second, you are fueling criminal organizations, or maybe foreign states, using this money for doing this and that. You mentioned terrorism, but also now we know that it's the case for foreign interferences. So if you like fueling these sort of things, go ahead, continue, but I don't think you will be too proud doing it. And they stopped.
Well, good job done, I guess, in this is Adriana. What about you? What's your perspective on this?
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Good to see you.
I've also downloaded illegal movies when I was younger in the internet. And I'm from Peru, in Latin America. And shadow economies are like a huge problem in my country, especially. Up to 70% of the economy is to some extent a shadow economy, informal economy. So in my case, if I buy something that's not on a big chain supermarket, it's probably
from the
informal in some sense. So that's something that has a lot of negative implications. Economic implications, because a lot of taxes are not recollected by the states. There's a productivity issue as well. But apart from the informal economy that is so wide in my country, we also have activities that are shadow economies, illegal economies, such as narco-traffic and illegal mining, that have tremendous impact in my country, in the region, and also in Europe. And
Yeah,
that's something
we'll certainly get to that. Thank you for that. Martin.
Yeah, I also recall what you mentioned in the 90s, all the pirating of the DVDs and other audio visuals. But what comes to me is a more recent story that I had in Brussels. I spent there quite some time, and there was a person that, well, we had a discussion. I told him, look, one of the products of nicotine products, the nicotine pouches, you can't find them, they are not allowed. And no, they are here, they are allowed. I said, no, I'm quite certain that they're not allowed here in Pakistan. You have to ask for Pablo. This is the coding language. So that's how I revealed that there are structures, even in countries when some products are legally not allowed for the market, but apparently there are structures that.
And what was the name that you were supposed to use?
Pablo.
Very good, Martin. So it brings me to Adriana, but if I could go back to you, so let's frame it in a context. Before we talk scale in Europe, threat in Europe, I wanted to use the Peruvian or South American example, if I may, in this situation, because obviously, as you said, this is probably much bigger than the European situation in this case. Probably, we'll get to the numbers. I'm sure it is, but quite often we do perceive South America in general, and I'm just not talking Peru, but especially Colombia, as this place where such stuff happens a lot. And that you mentioned narco trafficking, obviously that's probably the word we're familiar with, the term we're familiar with here in Europe. And I'm just wondering, how wrong do we get it after watching God knows how many seasons of the Narcos? Before we get into the European situation, like if we get this context here from you, Adriana, if you could tell us how wrong we are, or maybe how right we are if we just follow the Hollywood script.
I mean, you're not wrong, apart from all the drama that's in these TV shows. Narco-traffic is a very serious issue in the region. Actually, Colombia is well known for that, but Peru is not behind Colombia when it comes to coke production. Actually, I think we're on a tie with Colombia, and Bolivia is also one of the main coke producers. And at least in Peru, less than 10% of the coke that is produced is
consumed locally. Is that what you're looking for? No?
Yeah, I mean, there is some local consumption, but the state only gets to confiscate 10% of what is
confiscated.
Right. I was looking for the word, to confiscate 10% of what is produced. And the coke that we produce is smuggled through Bolivia, through Colombia, and that generates a lot of problems, especially in my country. Narco-traffic has been linked usually to terrorist groups. During the 80s and the 90s, we had a huge crisis provoked by terrorist groups, mainly by Sendero Luminoso, which was
the Shining Path. Yes.
The Shining Path. And the remains of this terrorist organization is working together with the narcs in the areas in which coke is produced.
And how many
So there's a clear link between terrorism and narco-trafficking.
And Adriana, how many years is that when you say, it was Sendero Luminoso, Shining Path, doing this, and they kind of disbanded thousands of years ago? I'm just wondering how many years after their disbandment or destruction, their remnants are still dealing
Well, this
with
has
drugs?
been going on for decades.
Right.
Sendero Luminoso was very active until the leader, Abimael Guzman, was captured in '93. And since then, the organization moved to the zone between our mountains and our jungle, which is where the coke is produced. And they have been operating there since the early 90s until today.
Right, slightly different situation than in Europe, but Martin, maybe you could tell us, after Adriana's, let's say, contextual remarks, how big is the scale of this? How much are we losing? What's the issue here? Because I mean, we discussed the petty usage of shadow economy, and probably many people would say, well, no biggie. Yeah, but what's the biggie?
Look, the scale can be enormous, and I can only tell you relatively fresh data that were very recently published for the EU, and these are fresh data for the year 2024. And unfortunately, what we see is a trend in increase of illicit and illegal activities in our domain of operation, and that comes to the levels of almost 11% of the total legal trade. So if you translate it in something that you can imagine, every 10th product, in fact, is getting to the consumer in a illegal way, to the detriment of the legal operators, to the detriment of the budget revenues, and the estimation is in that scale of a 15 billion loss, 15 billion euros for the EU itself. And the study also covered the rest of the Europe. So combined for Europe, it went up to more than 19 billion. And that is, of course, concerning. And I'm pretty sure we will discuss also later what do we see, because there are data points that are showing trends. It's not identical, it's not equal. We see some countries with certain, say, regulatory approaches that are suffering less. We see countries usually with the excessive and sudden and improper regulatory approaches that they are suffering much more, and also the trend is immediately visible from the data that you can see.
Right, so Martin, you said up to 19 billion. I recently had a discussion with some defense people in Slovakia, and apparently their military budget of Slovakia is 2.5 billion euros. So that's like a couple of Slovak defense budgets in the, when these budgets go up. And that kind of brings me to Nathalie, because we will discuss the consequences and what to do about it, but I think there is an elephant in the room. At least since 2022, we should all be aware in Europe that the stuff, if I could put it this way, that we're talking about, can also be employed or used in what I would call a hybrid operation by aggressive states who are not our friends, if I could put it this way. And Nathalie, I know you've been looking at this issue for quite some time from the European Parliament. So how does it look like? So Martin talked about the scale. We'll bring in Adriana on the context, but also how we can learn from the graver example, as it seems, right? Because Martin was saying 11%, we heard 70. I know they're not comparable, but let's stick to it for the sake of it. Nathalie, how does it look from where you sit?
Well, even before we woke up to the reality of the war of aggression in Ukraine and the hybrid warfare that Russia is waging towards us, it started in Sahel, where there were traffics, they were traditional Tuaregs, were paying no attention to borders and were trading cigarettes, sorry Martin, but on a small scale. But then cocaine came from Latin America, and the route towards Europe was going through Sahel. And the same guys who were trafficking cigarettes started trafficking cocaine, trafficking migrants, human trafficking, weapons. And when it started, I was already quite nervous about it. And people will tell me, but Tuaregs, they will never ally with jihadists. Yes. This is not their way of living. They don't like it. Look at today, look at Mali. Of course, they allied because they don't want functioning states. They are fighting against functioning states. And Russia learned the lesson. Nowadays, when there are foreign interferences in our democracies, and we know that how much they are, well, we saw Moldova, we saw Romania, and the list is getting longer, Russia is using criminal gangs. This foreign interference has become a business for criminal gangs, among other things. If you need someone to go to a warehouse in Vilnius or in Warsaw and put it on fire just to frighten people and turn public opinion against, let's say, migrants or refugees, you ask a criminal gang. If you need to have a spread of disinformation to discredit a political candidate, you ask private companies belonging to criminal gangs, and they work for anybody who is ready to provide money, and more cryptocurrencies, which makes it very difficult to tackle.
So you're saying, Nathalie, that essentially you have states employing that against us.
Definitely.
But a few years back, it was a slightly different game. Sahel, I remember there was this guy nicknamed Marlboro Man, who was the leading jihadi commander there, who was actually dealing cigarettes there in the Sahel. But then kind of it all got upgraded.
Exactly.
So my question would be to Adriana, if you don't mind. We clearly are seeing a situation in Europe in which we have a hostile actor who's still European, it seems, right? Or at least notionally, that's throwing this, again, stuff at us. Is there a lesson that we can learn from you in South America, Peru, or other places that, states used to do it against each other, used to employ these facts, using criminals to actually upset the others? Is this something you've seen? Is this something that you can tell us that we could, maybe not one for one, but somehow employ here as, in terms of countermeasures? Yeah, I think, that's...
Yeah, I don't know if we have lessons to communicate yet, because we're still struggling with that.
Well, that's lesson one, I guess.
Yes, especially since 2016, 2017, there was this huge wave of migration coming from Venezuela, which I think to some extent was a humanitarian crisis, of course, but I think it was also state-sponsored, and I think that Maduro's regime wanted to destabilize the region by sending organized crime or members of criminal organizations to the region, and now we have to deal with these criminal organizations that go beyond our borders. So I think that's one thing I could say about that. And I also think that some states in the region, like, for example, Bolivia, have become hubs for illegal economies. Intentionally, it's not a failure of the state that they have become a hub for illegal economies. I think
it's the state doing its job.
It's the state doing its job, and of course, these illegal economies end up creating resources for regimes like Venezuela, and that, of course, benefits, I think, Russia, Iran, and this...
We'll get back to both Russia and Iran in a second, because, I want to turn to Martin again. Martin, what's the scale of the, let's say, disruption in this sense? Because you gave us some numbers, but I'd like you to talk trends. What is it that we should be worried most about now? What is it that you're seeing in the data while looking at it, from the private sector perspective?
Okay, as we see those data coming for many, many years, you can see some patterns, okay? And I will talk a little bit about the root cause, but also about where I believe the solution lays, because sometimes we have a wrong perception where the solution is, while there isn't, okay? So if you look at the data, what is showing it clearly to us, that part of the situation is created by unwise approach to a regulation. For example, we see clearly that sudden high price hikes driven by tax increases are having much more negative effect than going into a gradual way, and evidence-based approach is showing us from the past what kind of effect is. is creating this. If we look now where the biggest scale of those figures I have mentioned, those 15 billions are, we see these are in the countries like Netherlands, like France, where really those phenomena happen. While we see in some other countries that had a different approach, that the problem is of a completely different scale. So data is here, solutions are here as well. Then what about the application? We often have the legislators often have a perception that if there is a problem somewhere, this is probably a problem of the base regulation.
Yeah.
While what we often see, there are 3 steps. There's the base regulation, which may be properly done, while then you have implementation in different countries, and then you have also the element of enforcement. And we sometimes wrongly perceive that if there is a problem, there must be done, for example, another high price hike through the taxation because it doesn't work, while the problem lays somewhere else at the level of enforcement. Because while we have, for example, within the EU, a certain level of harmonization at the EU level, then you scale it down, and there is an implementation in different member states, and then, for example, the authorities, the enforcement authorities, they are playing different roles. There are different levels of fines, there are different levels of penalties, there are different levels of capacities, exchange of information. Sometimes the national regulation is preventing them from even exchange some sort of information, while not, or at least not encouraging it. So this is where the situation is. So overall, we should approach to all 3 levels identically, and when we see a problem, we should identify where the problem lies, rather than rushing again to another
new piece of legislation or anything like that. So maybe I'll bring it to Nathalie, because Nathalie, you sit in a place where all of these problems kind of converge to some extent. All of the nationalities converge in Europe. And how do you see what, if I could ask you to, for a reaction to what Martin's been saying, that, 3 levels and we think the problem's here, whereas it's in a different place. Is this a common song that you hear?
That's very often in the European Union, that we struggle to have good regulations, and we do struggle in the European Parliament, in the Council, and finally we adopt a regulation and we think, job's done. But if we don't implement, and if we don't enforce, and if we don't harmonize the way we implement and enforce, there are thousands of loopholes everywhere, and criminal gangs are very good at finding loopholes. They know where to go, they know what to do to escape enforcement officers. So I think in this mandate, we are determined to pay much more attention to enforcement and to harmonization, not for the beauty of one size fits all and all Europeans should behave the same way. Not at all. Many things have to stay local because there are different cultures and diversity. But if we want to be efficient, we should not open the doors to smart guys who know how to navigate this system.
Right. But this, Nathalie, this is in a setting in which we kind of, we should trust, the 27.
Yeah.
We know that neither of the 20, none of the 27 is actively working in this fashion, just like you, Adriana, you mentioned Bolivia would, against each other. Okay, there are laggards, the criminals are quick on their feet, but I want to draw Adriana into this. How does it look from your perspective? When you're saying you have states that actively use criminality as a foreign policy tool, if you like, which we also do have, but not amongst the club of 27. Let's presume that nothing like that is happening at all, like at a zero level. How does it look in South America when, I remember reading about, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Venezuela that's been kind of like linked with Hezbollah to sell drugs. We don't have that stuff here, but I'm just wondering, how do you then organize cross-border cooperation in South America or for Peru in this situation, if you don't mind me asking? Again, yes, if you can.
We do have to some level cross-border cooperation with our neighbor countries, but that gets a little bit difficult when one of these neighbor countries, as I said, is intentionally a hub for illegal economies. A couple of weeks ago, I was in the border between Peru and Bolivia, which is a town called Desaguadero. Yeah. And you can see that the police, the migration office, they can't do enough to control the situation there. We have a very porous border, not only with Bolivia, but in general, with Brazil, with Colombia. The Amazon is in the middle, so that is a huge challenge for us. Border control is something that has become, in recent years, part of a central part of the public debate. And something that is also a problem is port control, and that's something that definitely involves Europe. And I think most of the drugs produced in South America come to Europe or go out of the region through our ports. And now there's this new actor involved. China has recently started operating a port in Peru, actually. So I think it's going to be interesting to analyze what the impact of that is going to have in the illegal
I'll have
market.
a question for you on that later on, don't you worry about that. So just to complicate matters further, China's also in Peru, very active. Before I go to you, Martin, we're kind of getting to the stage that we need to start talking about, okay, what do we do about this? And Adriana used the magic word of borders, controls, all these things that we, inverted commas, like. Nathalie, how do you look at it before I turn to Martin on this issue?
Well, a very important thing was mentioned, ports.
Yeah.
Ports inside the European Union compete against each other. They want to have as much trade as possible because they need to have money. And how do they get attractive? By having speedy procedures. Speedy procedures doesn't always mean that control of cargo is done properly, to say the least.
You're very diplomatic about it. Thank you.
And because we know it, and sometimes because simply ports cannot afford to have more people, customs officers are not sufficient to do their job, there is something we could do, as well as we do it with migration and Frontex. We have a European agency taking care of our external borders. We should have a European customs agency providing support and enhancing cooperation between countries to make sure that there are no loopholes or that these loopholes are identified and that countries get support and that we can have more trust on what's coming from outside, inside the European Union.
Right, Nathalie, thank you for this. Martin, how would you react to that? European Customs Agency, ports are the problem. How does it, look from your perspective? What do we do to make it better, to make our world a better place?
I think that all combines together. What I think is very important, if we know the scale of the problem, and as you have contextualized, 15 billion only in our domain is a sizable amount of lost revenues, and it's also a loss for the European economy in the current day. So probably a meaningful and professional solution should be found. And I think the solution can be only based if we look at all those three levels, where the economic operators, state enforcement, and the legislation and the decision makers, they will have a look at it in combination, in synergy, and they can work together. I am happy to mention that just the day before we came here, I was informed that in the Justice and Home Affairs Council today, ministers, they have adopted and decided that the excise fraud in the tobacco area will be listed on the priority areas for enforcement as one of the very relevant criminal acts. So that, I think, is also a sign that our leaders are aware of the scale of the problem, and then we should seek together solutions.
As you said, a couple of military budgets of Slovakia in this. Maybe a good question here that popped up on our Slido, and I do encourage you to join us there, is can I ask you all, maybe starting with Adriana, because I do believe that I'm just wondering, what's the level of what's the usage of cash? How many people prefer cards or cash to pay in Peru or South America? It's a very ignorant question, but I'm just wondering, how do you look? And is there a threat in it? Because there are countries in Europe which want to ban cash. There are countries in Europe which want to write cash into the constitution, that you have the right to use cash. Again, how does it look from your perspective? Is this an issue in relation to what we're discussing here, shadow economy? Again, if I can ask you.
I forgot again. It's definitely an issue. We have a very digitalized economy. You can use cards in Peru, or these apps like Venmo or similar, and it's very widespread, the use of these apps. But it doesn't seem to have a direct impact in issues like money laundering, for example. I don't think banning cash would be something viable, at least in Latin America.
I think the government of Norway would disagree with you, but we're talking Latin America here, so you wouldn't go for it.
I wouldn't go for it. And I think given that most people, at least in Peru, use these apps and all transactions are bankerized, I don't know if that's the correct term, but it really doesn't have an impact in lowering the levels of money laundering. But I think more cooperation between financial intelligence units between the countries in the region would be something to focus on instead of banning cash.
Right, okay, so I'll turn to Nathalie. A European decision maker, cash, no cash, and FIUs, financial intelligence unit.
Well, there are discussions in my home country, in France, about banning cash to go against drug trafficking. And it sounds, well, exciting in a way, but let me go a little further east to Moldova, where you remember last year's elections were tense, and there was a lot of vote buying and pressure on voters, and a lot of money coming from Russia, or an oligarch which took refuge in Russia to interfere into the elections in Moldova. Some of this money was brought into Moldova in cash, and people were arrested with suitcases full of cash, like in the movies. But most of it was done via apps. People were able to download apps and go through Dubai or Kazakhstan or you name it to get the money for what they had to do. So I'm not sure it fixes the problem, and even less when we see cryptocurrencies being used more and more for gray economy or illegal activities. You may have heard 2 weeks ago that Nigel Farage, the head of the Reform Party in the UK, had announced that his party would be financed by cryptocurrencies,
yes.
which make it untrackable where the money comes from. Is it from inside the UK? Is it from outside? Is it a foreign state? It's going to be very difficult. So indeed, cooperation between financial intelligence services is key, but we also need to criminalize a number of activities linked to interferences. Because very often, financial intelligence agencies do get some intelligence, some tips, but if it's not clearly legal, there's very little they can do about it.
So that's a bit of a loophole in itself.
That's one of the loopholes, indeed.
Right. Thank you, Nathalie. Martin, where do you stand on that? I mean, it's a pity that you're not working for a major bank, and I'm asking you this question, but cash, no cash?
No worries. I will not pretend I'm expert in this domain while I'm not, but I see there a clear link to the root cause of this. For me, this is only an enabler. It is a tool to facilitate the activity. And I think I can talk more about the domain of the activity. We need to do everything possible on all those 3 levels I have mentioned to
Disrupt the activity.
to prevent the illicit trade in tobacco domain of such a scale to happen. For me, those flows is just enabler for this problem, and I think this is where, from my perspective, the debate is centered. What can we do together, not to have 15 billion of tax losses from illegal trade? Where the governments, the economies, and the legal operators who are subject to full regulation and are fully compliant are supposed. And I think that the message is simple. We should avoid massive, sudden taxation, like we have a current debate on relatively recently. We should also have a good collaboration and listen to each other when it comes to implementation, and we should collaborate. And we do a lot of activities, for example, in collaboration with the enforcement activities to make it happen. So let's limit the scale of the problem.
Sure. So you're talking, Martin, you're talking about the scale of the problem. Let me maybe also go back to some of the, let's say, outcomes of that. Again, back to you, Nathalie, if you don't mind me saying, and then we'll turn to Adriana. On the European side of things, there are questions about hybridity here and how it's which are the key areas where hybrid threat actors used organized crime to attack democracy, from what you're saying. Now, Nathalie, bringing you back to your opening statement, basically.
Well, now hybrid threats take very different forms. It can be cyber attacks, it can be interference in electoral processes, it can be information manipulation, sabotage, or some sort of low-level and low-cost terrorism. When in the middle of the German political campaign, you saw a number of attacks by people who were supposed to be isolated murderers. We are not so sure that they were so isolated. We are not so sure that they were not first criminal gangs hiring them in the name of foreign states. You can see in a less dramatic situation, but still, in France, repeatedly, there were moments where you had Stars of David painted on the walls of Paris, or coffins in front of the Eiffel Tower, or red hands on the Shoah Memorial, or a few days ago, green painting on synagogues. Of course, it triggers debates, it creates anger and fear. Every single time, police found out that people who had done this were coming from either the Balkans or Moldova or places like that, and they were hired by criminal gangs. These criminal gangs did it on behalf of Russia. So it's completely intertwined. First, because Russia is busy with its war in Ukraine. Second, because it's a low-cost sort of warfare. We know that, for instance, in the Balkans, after the end of the war in Bosnia, we failed miserably on getting weapons back. And it created what could be expected, a huge level of trafficking of small weapons throughout Europe. These weapons were sent to criminal gangs in the south of France to protect drug trafficking. And now we have casualties, not only revenge murders between gangs, but also civilians, ordinary people who get caught.
So basically, in a way, you're saying that we're seeing a movie that we kind of had seen before, but now it's...
Now it's getting to another level and it's being utilized, as well as Iran in Nordic countries, uses criminal gangs both to, again, commit murders, assassination attempts, again, dissidents as well, but also to create tension in the society.
So essentially, Nathalie, from what you're saying, this is kind of like you rent a criminal to do your political work in this sense, or wannabe criminal in this sense, to upset your enemy as a mean of political warfare.
Exactly, and to create tensions within democracies and to convince more and more people that maybe democracy is not the best way for public order and stability. And we see some polls among young people who question the efficiency of democracy.
That it doesn't work for them, right, in this sense. So we'll turn to that, and Martin, I'll go back to you. How you want to convince us? I mean, you've convinced us, but convincing other or European decision makers of your cause, when we are quite busy with some things that Nathalie just talked about. But I mean, I want to put you on the spot for this one. Don't hold it against me. But Adriana, before we go on to Martin, there's plenty of questions that are addressed to you, and I think. Because you mentioned, we used the magic word, drug trafficking and drugs, South America, all in one sentence, and that kind of triggered an avalanche of questions. But I want to ask you one, because we're talking mostly someone else does something against us in Europe when we're kind of struggling with the response, and we're trying to figure out the response. But in the case of a country such as yours, if you have so much production of the cocaine within the country, how does it influence the internal politics, not just economy, but I mean, what kind of, how much of a problem is this for us naive Europeans, if you could tell us?
Well, it does.
Again, yes.
Again. It does influence politics, of course. Narco-traffic is perceived by parts of our population as a perfect legitimate activity. So in some areas of the country, it's politically very complicated to fight against this problem. So the interests of drug dealers and narco traffic are definitely represented in politics. Luckily, we do not have the cartels in Peru. I mean, the problem could be much worse. Like, for example, in Mexico, they just passed a reform in order to get some judges elected by democratically in some areas of the country, and that has resulted in many judges linked to the cartels in Mexico, for example. That is not a problem that we face in Peru. I mean, of course, there is some level of influence, but we do not have organized cartels in Peru. So I think that kind of mitigates a little bit of the problem, but we do have illegal miners very much embedded in our politics. And a lot of legislation in favor of illegal mining has been passed in the last couple of years because of that, and that is a very difficult problem to face.
But can you quickly tell us about the scale? Because when you say illegal mining, I know this in Poland. There used to be a lot of illegal mining in Poland and in many other European countries. But I'm just wondering, how big is that? And if you can tackle this one, and maybe for the wrap up, the easy question: is China somehow in all of this? Someone's asking. Is China involved in the shadow economy at all? You told us about the port. So these two for you, just to wrap it up.
Well, I think we produce gold, and a very important amount of the gold that is exported is a product of illegal mining. And China definitely is a main buyer of that gold. So there is some level of involvement. I think, the gold that is extracted from Peru it's extracted illegally, then it goes, most of it, to Bolivia, and then it becomes legal, and China buys it. So among other countries, there are some European countries that also buy gold from Bolivia. So I mean, its origin is illegal, but then on paper, it's not once it gets to the international market.
So it becomes legal, right? Nathalie, you have a comment on that? Or I don't want to put you on the spot, you don't, but Martin, then I'll put you on the spot if you don't mind. Because the message is we're kind of busy in Europe with wars here and there. I guess the news from the morning that do not help, if I could put it this way. From your experience, when you're asking the questions you're asking, which are legit questions, when you're asking for solutions, maybe for people's involvement in the solutions that you're suggesting, how difficult it is for you to pitch this, if you like, if I can put you a bit on the spot for this one?
Look, I think the reflection in Europe, and we had Draghi report, so I would say the analysis, the diagnosis is there. I think we need a strong, economically sound and strong continent that will be able to cope with the challenges that are ahead of us. And all we are discussing here is part of it. So I think pragmatism, collaboration, and also listening to all the industries, because they often have solutions to offer, and at the same time to pragmatically see what is where Europe can base its prosperity and economic soundness, so that we have the stable base that we can then use with full force to find solutions to the big problems that are, or big challenges that are ahead of Europe and which, in fact, this conference is of many of those.
Martin, thank you, because you mentioned, just to kind of closely, to close our session, Martin used these phrases, sound, strong, continent, and quite often, Nathalie, I do get the impression that the targets of those saboteurs and the criminals that are targeting Europe, they're actually they're targeting private entities. They're not only targeting, let's say, rail infrastructure, which is in the hands of the state, but they're, burning down supermarkets, they're burning down warehouses. So I guess there is some platform for understanding between different sides of the conversation, I would say.
Well, the only way to succeed in this is to stop having borders in our minds, because criminals don't have. So no borders between European Union members, strong cooperation, but also cooperation between private sector and state actors, because we need to understand what's going on. We need to work together, and visibility can only come from this cooperation, and cooperation from consumers and citizens alike. Raising awareness. We started by saying the moment you discovered that downloading illegally movies or music was funding terrorists, you felt bad and you stopped. This is very efficient. There are stories to be made. There are, I would say, Netflix series that should just describe this. That it's not only fun to cheat or to do something a little bit illegal and you think you're a hero. Actually, you are fueling violence, blood, and you would regret it. But you could be proud if, as a citizen, as a consumer, you decide to behave more responsibly.
Nathalie, thank you for that. I mean, if anyone wants to employ me as a coordinator or a consultant on a Netflix series on how I stopped downloading the movies, I'll very happily do that. Look, I'll put it this way. It's a task of a 19 million euro size, or 70% of Peruvian economy size. So quite a task, I would say.
But it's worth it.
Exactly. And if you throw in the Iranians, the Venezuelans, and the Russians, that only gets even more complicated. So I would like the audience to thank our panelists who gave us a brilliant snapshot of the situation both in Europe and in South America. So a round of applause for you. Thank you very much. And the closing of the stage will be done by an MC, so I would like the panelists to remain seated. Thank you, Martin, again. Thank you, Adriana. Thank you, Nathalie. This will be happening. I'm going to be told over my headphone in a second what's happening next. So obviously, this almost wraps up our day, but I cannot say anything more because there will be something else
Thanks
happening.
a lot, Kacper. Great panel. Thanks, super moderation. Thanks a lot. So this wraps up day 2. We have talked Ukraine, we have talked the Green Deal, we have talked the Middle East. We're going to continue again tomorrow at 9 o'clock on all 3 stages, talking about all sorts of issues, AI, multilateralism, global south. But the key thing you want to find out now is the cocktail reception, isn't it? So 3 buses, 7 o'clock, 7:30, 8 o'clock. Catch one of those, preferably the first one, because, you know, it's cocktails, they are for free, everyone are welcome, and I hope to see you again tomorrow here, hungover, but happy. So, 7, 7:30, 8. Take the 7 o'clock one, because, you know, we're thirsty and it's warm outside. And that wraps it up. Enjoy.
Thank you, Richard.